Amidst the bustling city streets and crowded shopping centers, Lois Pearson always preferred the peaceful seclusion of a small wooden house nestled among green hills where she had grown up. Her family had lived there since her birth in 1949, and Lois hardly ever left her ancestral home. She lived on a modest income from leasing her land to a man who grazed his cattle on it. After her mother's passing, Lois found herself relying more on her own resources. A few years ago, when her pipes froze, she decided to do without running water and carried water from a well. In her daily activities, she used a single lamp, which she carried from room to room on a long cord. Every Sunday, Lois attended church, and once a month, she would travel to the nearest town, Mineral Wells, to buy groceries and do laundry at a self-service laundromat. She always felt more comfortable with animals in nature and often spent entire days without interacting with other people. Lois never had a boyfriend. She never even undressed in front of a man, not even a doctor. Lois met Jeffrey Maxwell in 2001, shortly after he acquired land in Weatherford, Texas, located to the west of her property. At that time, Maxwell was just under 50 years old, while Lois was slightly over 50. They exchanged a few words on occasion, and he would wave to her as he passed by her house. Once, Maxwell invited her to have lunch with him. The invitation caught Lois off guard, and she declined in her usual gentle manner. On another occasion, he came to her house, jumped out of his car, and out of the blue asked for a kiss. Lois felt offended, especially by the expectant smirk on his face. She demanded that he never come to her house again. In 2005, he moved away, but to her immense surprise, they crossed paths again before his departure. Their conversation was brief and unburdened. He stopped by to show her pictures of a modular home he was building in Corsicana and to bid farewell. Little did Lois know that this farewell visit would not be her last encounter with Jeffrey Maxwell. On the afternoon of March 1st, 2011, Lois was preparing for her regular trip to town for groceries. She was getting ready to leave when a silver Chevy Trailblazer pulled up behind her 1970 Nova car. If he had arrived just 5 minutes later, he would have missed her. Maxwell warmly greeted Lois and smiled. He stepped out of his car and engaged her in a conversation about the church. As she replied, he began slowly approaching her, and she started backing away. Their movements quickly led them to the back of her house. Feeling slightly embarrassed by the nearby containers of well water, Lois attempted to steer Maxwell back towards the driveway. Suddenly, she noticed a strange shift in his expression. It was so evident that they both stopped talking. Maxwell reached into his coat pocket for a container with an odd lid and held it up to Lois's face. Before she could say anything, he released a stream of pepper spray, attempting to hit both of her eyes. However, the spray had no effect. Lois turned and ran toward the barbed wire fence near her car. Lois had barely reached the fence and put her hands on the top wire when he caught up to her. Grabbing her, he lifted her up, but she held onto the wire even as the spikes dug into her fingers and blood dripped from her hands. Yet he was too strong and managed to throw her to the ground in front of his SUV. Lois attempted to scream as loudly as she could, but her house was secluded and there was no one around. Maxwell picked Lois up again, put what seemed like handcuffs on her, and opened the back door of her house. She struggled to free herself as he pushed her into the kitchen. He grabbed a wooden rolling pin from the kitchen table, her mother's rolling pin, and struck Lois on the left side of her head. When she didn't fall, he swung again, hitting her harder on the right side this time. The blow sent her to the floor. Lois felt her eyelids swell almost instantly, but she continued to fight to escape until he grabbed a large kitchen knife. She sat down quietly, feeling the blood and dizziness. Maxwell asked where she kept duct tape. She remained silent. He repeated the question but got no response. He then cut the cord of her lamp into pieces and tied Lois to the living room door handle. He went outside to his car. He was gone for just a few seconds, but she managed to free her wrists. She had always had rather slender wrists. She jumped up and ran out the door in the opposite direction. By the time he returned to the house, realized she was missing, and jumped in his car, Lois had already run a few hundred yards down the road, even with ankle cuffs on. Maxwell chased after her, braking right in front of her and blocking her path. He stepped out of the car with a gun in his hand. "Now we're moving on to Plan B," he said with a chilling expression on his face. He opened the back door of his car and pushed her inside, fastening handcuffs on her again. Then he used a small piece of duct tape to cover her mouth. "Are you a virgin?" he asked, grinning. That's when she started crying. He laughed at her tears, slammed the door shut, and got behind the wheel. As he drove away, he told her he would have to come back and burn down her house. Lois heard the car pulling onto the highway. She thought about trying to lift her feet so that passing drivers would notice her handcuffs and help her. But realizing the car had tinted windows and other drivers wouldn't see her, she felt utterly helpless. She considered hitting Maxwell with a tire iron, but she knew it would only enrage him further. She also thought about opening the back door and rolling out onto the road, but she couldn't find the handle. Maxwell heard her praying and promised that after he was done with her, she would stop believing in him. The car veered off the road. The terrain was unfamiliar to Lois. The abductor led her into the garage of a house and closed the door behind her. She surveyed the room, cluttered with a variety of items. There was patio furniture, a lawnmower, numerous tools, a washing machine, and a dryer in the corner. Maxwell unfastened her handcuffs. He began removing Lois's clothes, everything except her bra. He cut it off with a knife. Then he attached each of her hands to the ends of a steel pole suspended from the ceiling by chains. Without comprehending what was happening, she watched as he flicked a switch on the yellow control panel attached to the ceiling by a cable, at the same point where the chains were connected. She felt her arms rise first, then her shoulders lifted abruptly. The motor in the ceiling hummed as she ascended higher and higher. When Maxwell flicked the switch again, the motor went silent, and Lois felt her naked legs dangling helplessly in the air. Jeffrey Maxwell was known for his ability to escape from any situation, whether it was burning down his own house for insurance money or shooting cattle to avoid feeding them, or even something far more sinister. Maxwell could always manage to avoid punishment. He got to know Martha Martinez from Mexico through postal correspondence in the early 1980s. They exchanged letters for a long time, and eventually Jeffrey traveled to Mexico and proposed to her. Her family wasn't initially fond of him because he skillfully played on her insecurities and lack of self-confidence. Her family begged her not to marry Maxwell, but the 29-year-old woman believed that this was her chance to become a wife and mother. She married Maxwell, moved with him to Watauga, a suburb of Fort Worth, Texas, and gave birth to a son. This was Maxwell's third child. At 18, he had married his girlfriend Rita when she became pregnant, but they divorced in 1979 after the birth of their second child. Although Martha kept her husband's behavior hidden from her family, she couldn't hide the bruises on her arms and legs, as if from shackles, from her friends. But this was nothing compared to the horror that Martha would experience later. On Sunday, April 19, 1987, a deputy sheriff from Ardmore, Oklahoma, called the police station in Watauga, Texas. He reported that early that morning, they found a woman on the road. She had been severely beaten, and she had lost a lot of blood due to a deep wound on her neck. The woman was Martha Maxwell. The police immediately went to the family's home and questioned Maxwell about the last time he had seen his wife. He claimed not to have seen her since the night before and expressed surprise when told that Martha was injured but alive. Fortunately, doctors managed to save her life. Upon regaining consciousness, she recounted how she and her husband had argued. He beat her, and she fell asleep on the couch, only to wake up tied with duct tape. After further abuse, Maxwell forced her to drink a liquid that caused her to immediately fall asleep. She woke up in the hospital. Initially, Martha cooperated with the police, but after her husband's arrest and charges of kidnapping were filed against him, she suddenly stopped communicating with investigators. Without her testimony, the police couldn't charge Maxwell with anything, as a search of the house and car yielded no evidence. Jeffrey Maxwell slipped through the cracks again. Martha took her son and left for Mexico. However, her husband wasn't going to let her go so easily. He bombarded her with letters, playing on her Catholic upbringing and even accusing her of what had happened. Her family pleaded with Martha not to return to Jeffrey, but just a month after the charges against him were dropped, she was back living with him. It seemed like life was getting back on track for the family. Martha enrolled in college, and they bought a new house. But it was just the calm before the storm. On May 10, 1992, two family members received letters from her, or supposedly from her. Martha wrote that she was leaving her husband and son and didn't plan to have any contact for a while. Her family didn't believe that the letters were from Martha. Firstly, she usually just called them. Secondly, if she had written a letter, it would have been in Spanish, not English. When Martha's brother called Maxwell, he said that Martha had left and hung up. He had to come to Texas to file a missing person report for his sister. He was convinced that she was dead, and it was her husband's fault because she would never have left without money, documents, a car, and most importantly, her beloved son. However, the search for Martha yielded no results. Years later, when police asked him if he had done anything that might have led to his wife Martha's death, Maxwell replied, "Not intentionally." A few years after her disappearance, Jeffrey filed for divorce. Once the divorce was granted, he immediately remarried his first wife, Rita, and she and her 3 daughters from her second marriage moved in with him. Soon enough, the girls began complaining at school about their stepfather's advances, and Rita's best friend revealed that just 2 days before their wedding, Maxwell had assaulted her. However, it was only after police visited the family's home due to complaints from Rita's youngest daughter about her stepfather's behavior that Rita took the children, left the state, changed her name, and escaped. Lifting Lois into the air, Maxwell began yelling at her. He was still angry that she hadn't listened to him in the car. The woman felt his hands on her, then sensed something hard and pointed, reminiscent of a plastic bullet. It seemed he was trying to use this vibrating object to cause her pain, and it was truly painful. Stating that Lois would be with him for 2 weeks, Maxwell started hitting her, using different sizes of rods. He struck her everywhere, even on her chest, which was unbearable. Lois could do nothing but scream in agony. When he finally lowered her to the floor, she could barely stand. Maxwell led her to the bathroom and ordered her to wash up. At first, she caught a glimpse of bruises all over her body. Her right eyelid was swollen to the point that she could barely see, fearing she might lose her eye. The abductor himself quickly took a shower and gave her his jeans. They were oversized for Lois and smelled like Maxwell. It was terrible, but she understood that she would survive longer if she didn't provoke him over trivial matters. That night, he chained her ankles to the bed, turned off the lights, and lay down beside her. Lois couldn't close her eyes, and Maxwell hardly slept. Every time she turned toward him, she encountered his round, owl-like eyes, visible even in the darkness. Thus passed her first night away from home in over 40 years. When the morning of the second day came, Maxwell told Lois that he needed to go to the store to buy more padlocks. He led her to the garage and showed her a homemade wooden box. The wood looked and smelled new. He suggested to her a choice, a torture device or a box. Her decision was instantaneous. She would do anything, just not get on that machine. Maxwell inserted a metal ring into her mouth as a gag and secured it with a strap. Then he fastened handcuffs and shackles on Lois and ordered her to lie in the box. Through the gag, she asked if she would have enough air. Maxwell placed a wrench on the edge of the box, leaving the lid slightly ajar, and then left. Lois waited a few seconds after hearing the sound of his car's engine. Then she tried to get out of the box, but no matter how hard she pushed, she only managed to push the key away and lock herself in complete darkness. It was only when Maxwell returned that she realized he had moved the box under a heavy workbench. Upon returning home, the abductor led Lois to the bedroom and undressed her. Her parents had never discussed intimate matters with Lois, and she didn't know what he was doing, but she felt uncomfortable. When she screamed in pain, he asked her how she would like to go to the garage and hang upside down. After that, she tried not to make a sound. When he finished, he chained her legs to the bed again. That night, exhausted, she managed to get some sleep. In the morning, Maxwell had to go to Dallas to pay a bill for his son's repair. He put a gag in her mouth and chained her as usual. Lois could hear cars, motorcycles, and motorboats in the distance. She screamed and called for help, but because of the gag, no one could hear her cries. Only when Maxwell returned and removed the metal ring from her mouth did Lois realize that he had broken her front teeth. But on that day, she lost something much more important. On television, they showed a photo of her driver's license, and Maxwell allowed her to watch the news. That's how Lois Pearson learned that the house where she had grown up, holding so many memories, was no longer there, and she was listed as missing, and they were searching for her. The following days were similar, one to another. In the mornings, he satisfied his needs with her and then left her alone. For several days, he ensured she was chained to the bed, even when he quickly took a shower or went to the mailbox. But gradually, the abductor became less cautious. One day, she noticed he had left his mobile phone in the bathroom. The thought crossed her mind to take it and call the police. But she had never used a mobile phone before and was afraid she might do something wrong. She worried that he would not only stop trusting her, but also use that torture device again. Lois abandoned that idea, but she never stopped pondering an escape, or at least a way to shift the power balance. And after a week in captivity, she saw a way to fend off his persistent advances. On the 7th day, as he lay beside her and moved his mouth towards hers, she recalled her parents' words. They had told her that supposedly there was a bronchitis-inducing agent in her oral cavity. This was one of the reasons why she never kissed boys when she was younger. So, she allowed him to touch her lips, referring to this maneuver as a battle of microbes. What actually happened then is hard to discern now, but the next day Maxwell woke up with a fever and chills. He was pale and could barely get out of bed. He didn't attempt to use her again. On the morning of the 8th day, he demanded that she write him a check for $500. He explained that groceries cost money and instructed her to date it February 2nd, more than a month earlier. He had already taken $60 from her wallet, which she had prepared for shopping in town, but she didn't object, hoping that the money would help her buy a few more days. It was March 12th, 2011. The clock's hands were approaching 6 in the evening when Sergeant Ricky Montgomery and 4 other police officers pulled up to a modest house on the shores of a lake in Corsicana, 80 kilometers south of Dallas, to ask the homeowner a few questions about the missing 62-year-old woman. After her house had burned down and her remains were nowhere to be found, search teams began combing the surrounding area. Helicopters with thermal imaging were brought in for the search, but after a few days, the police came to the grim conclusion that they wouldn't find Lois Pearson alive. The efforts continued with search dogs trained to find bodies, and they even brought in pumps to drain 2 ponds, but the woman was nowhere to be found. Then, 8 days after the fire, $500 were withdrawn from her account. The check was made out to Jeffrey Maxwell and dated a few weeks prior. When the police found out that Maxwell also owned a blue SUV matching the description of the vehicle seen by a neighbor on the day of the fire, a judge issued a search warrant for the vehicle, and officers traveled over 160 kilometers to question the man. Sunday, March 12th, unfolded like any other day. The 12th day of Lois's captivity under Maxwell proceeded like usual. Lois sat on the floor praying while Maxwell watched television when they both heard a knock at the door. The abductor jumped up and quickly led Lois to a distant room, instructing her to stay quiet. Before he could handcuff her or put a gag on her, they heard another knock, even more persistent. The man hurried to the door. Lois could hear voices from outside but couldn't make out the conversation. She managed to escape the room, and through the window, she saw the word sheriff on a car parked by the road. At first, fear immobilized her entire body, which surprised her. But then she realized it was her chance, and she ran. Jeffrey Maxwell emerged from the house and firmly closed the door behind him. He smiled at the police officers, and in an apologetic tone said that his house was in a terrible mess. Sergeant Ricky Montgomery explained that they were questioning people who knew Miss Lois Pearson, or those who had recently been in the vicinity of her house. Maxwell replied that Lois was his neighbor, but he hadn't seen her in a long time. He added that Lois had sent him a check because she owed him money. Montgomery continued to ask Maxwell if he would be willing to come to the sheriff's office when the door swung wide open. They heard a weak voice of an older woman. The woman appeared frail, hunched over, her unkempt hair tangled, and her face covered in bruises. She swiftly slipped past Maxwell and approached the officers. Although Montgomery had a photograph of the missing woman, he didn't recognize her. "Who are you?" he asked. Before she could answer, one of the officers behind Montgomery exclaimed in surprise, "It's her, Lois Pearson," she confirmed. Everyone present was momentarily stunned. Regaining their composure, the police officers handcuffed Maxwell. At first, the woman told the officers that Maxwell had been her friend and hadn't done anything to her. Later, she learned about the term Stockholm Syndrome, but all she remembers about her rescue is the fear for her life. After a few minutes, when Maxwell was taken away, Lois told the officers that he had kidnapped her, beaten her, and done things to her that she didn't want. At first, the officers didn't understand what she meant when she mentioned the machine. But as soon as they searched the house, they found the device she described and a yellow control device covered in blood. They also found whips, handcuffs, weapons, 4 adult toys of varying sizes, and numerous pieces of adhesive tape throughout the house. Blood was on the bedding, on the floor in front of the car, and on various items of clothing in the house. The police also discovered an extensive collection of adult films. 3 days of questioning later, Maxwell confessed to nearly everything. The trial began on February 14, 2012. In the months between his arrest and the trial, Maxwell lost over 60 pounds and shaved his beard. Now he appeared as a lanky, ghostly figure in an ill-fitting suit. The jury took less than an hour to find Maxwell guilty on all 3 counts. The judge had prohibited mentioning his wife Martha's disappearance during the trial, but the jurors heard from Rita's friend, whom Maxwell had assaulted 2 days before their wedding. Testimonies were also given by Rita's daughters, who described the impact of stepfather's advances on them. Lois also testified in court. She had always been shy about speaking in public, but now she spoke firmly about what she had endured during those 12 days of captivity. She described the injuries that continued to trouble her even a year later and remembered the 3 cats, Bluey, Blackie, and a nameless kitten that had perished in the fire. Most of all, she thought that if she remained innocent throughout her life, she would be rewarded in heaven. Again, the jury took less than an hour to sentence the defendant to 3 consecutive life terms. The judge ruled that he would not serve the sentences concurrently, meaning that Maxwell would be eligible for parole no sooner than 119 years. After the verdict, a crowd watched as a deputy sheriff handcuffed Maxwell's wrists and shackled his ankles before leading him out of the courtroom. Normally, victims of such crimes don't want their names mentioned in the media, but after the trial, Lois told reporters that she wanted her story to be known so that everyone could hear how her faith had carried her through difficult times. Sometimes she wonders why he chose her. Perhaps Maxwell knew that if she disappeared from home for a few days, no one would notice. The perfect victim. Had he not made a mistake and not put her to sleep, someone might have searched for her. Someone might have noticed she was missing. After the 12 days with Jeffrey Maxwell, Lois was left with memories of her former life. He took away much more than just her home or the car she loved. He took her piano and her mother's sheet music. Now she no longer has a photograph of her father, and she's unsure if one even exists. Her church raised over $17,000 to buy her a small trailer. It's not the home she grew up in, but the old house was always cold in winter and infested with pests, while the trailer is cozy and warm. The church even gifted her a new piano, and she now has a phone. Lois Pearson still prefers the tranquility of nature, but she relishes the time she spends with her new friends. "Before this, I never knew how much I loved people," she confesses.